Okay, so this is our second review video. This is part 2. So this will cover Units 5 and Unit 6. So starting where we left off after World War II, the US and USSR were pretty much the only remaining superpowers because they did not experience as much damage from the actual war as Germany, Britain, France, and Japan. So they were the two main superpowers. They were the most industrialized with the strongest economy, biggest populations, most advanced. However, they both had strong economies, but they differed in that the US was capitalist and the USSR was communist. So in capitalism, private citizens own the wealth, whereas in communism, the government owns the wealth, and there are no social classes, no private wealth. But the communist system did industrialize Russia, so they were up to par with the United States industrially. And so this strengthened their economy and their global influence. And World War II really was what strengthened the U.S. economy after the Great Depression, really pulled the whole world out of the Great Depression. So these two conflicting ideologies led the rest of Europe to have to choose sides. Most of the Eastern European countries turned communist, and most of the Western European countries turned capitalist. And so, or remained capitalist. They weren't affected by the influence because they were affected by the influence of the United States. So the philosophical division between the two was known as the Iron Curtain. Now, the Iron Curtain is not a physical division, remember. It is just like a border of a country. It is just where the two sides meet together, but it is not a physical, actual wall or barrier, just the division ideologically. So, as you know, the atomic bomb is what ended World War II in the Pacific, and this also led to the USSR becoming competitive with the US. Remember how Stalin was a little bit suspicious or jealous of Truman's technological advancement? At the Yalta Conference, in that DBQ we did before the terrorism one, we saw Stalin's kind of jealousy come out there. So he really wanted the USSR to be better than the United States. And this led to an arms race. So each side built up their militaries, their weaponry, their technology, everything like that, in order to have the most advanced weapons. That's the arms race. The arms race then led to the space race because after we had done everything we could on Earth, basically, we needed a new frontier to attack from. So that was space. So first we did satellites, and then it was eventually leading to landing on the moon. So because missiles such as those ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, which were developed after World War II ended, those could be launched from space. So that's why space was an important factor. So it became the first one to claim space as their territory. That was what the space race really was. And eventually out of this, a hydrogen bomb eventually developed. And so when we refer to nuclear weapons, this is typically what we think of. So this is the deadliest weapon ever. It would demolish a country, way deadlier than the atomic bomb. So the atomic bomb was developed during World War II, and then after World War II ended with the atomic bomb, they said, okay, if we can do that, what else can we do? And through the space race, built up ICBMs, they built up hydrogen bombs, they built up space technology. All this led to nuclear paranoia. So every citizen was afraid that all of a sudden this giant nuclear bomb would fall from the sky and demolish the Earth. And remember, that led to a lot of the safety precautions we have in place today that ensure a more peaceful world and preventing a nuclear holocaust. So the closest we ever came to that nuclear holocaust was the Cuban Missile Crisis. A U.S. spy plane found out the Soviets were constructing a missile launch site on Cuba, which is only 90 miles away from the United States. So this was very, very scary to us and very, very real. So President Kennedy, who was president at this time in 1962, orders a naval blockade. So we decided to surround Cuba with our Navy so that the USSR could not transport their missiles there. And it was successful. And eventually we strike a deal with the USSR to dismantle their launch site on Cuba. So Aside from the arms race, both countries wanted to expand the influence of their ideology and prevent the other ideology from spreading. So they used spying, they used scaring each other to the point of compromise, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis is a great example of that, and proxy wars. When they used spying, the U.S. used their organization, which was the CIA, and the USSR had the KGB, which is their equivalent. So they would send in KGB agents, CIA agents to spy on other governments, find out secret documents, blueprints for weapons, etc. And the proxy wars took place in places like Guatemala, Nicaragua, Korea, Vietnam. Those are all proxy wars. So one of the things that we start to see happen, which increases our fear of communism, is that we see that communism is starting to take over other massive countries. So for instance, Mao Zedong led the communist revolution in China using Stalin's model and Lenin's model and Karl Marx's model of communism. So in 1949, communism takes over in China, and between the 1950s and the 1970s, Mao initiates agriculture and industrial reform, known as 5-year plans. You might remember the most successful of these is the Great Leap Forward. So that was one of the 5-year plans that really was intended to build up the industry of China and also reform the agriculture so that land was redistributed, peasants got fair pay, people weren't like plantation owners basically, and so there was a little bit of more equal distribution of wealth because there is no private wealth anymore. The peasants would work on the government-owned farms. So same model that they used in Russia. So we decide that we really need to stop the spread of communism. So we enact this foreign policy known as containment, which is to fight communists wherever possible. So some of our other weapons is military and economic aid. So we had 2 plans. The Marshall Plan gave money to Eastern European countries to recover. So the Marshall Plan, remember, is money. And then the Truman Doctrine was our other plan using military and economic aid to try and dissuade communism. And the Truman Doctrine gave military aid, such as tanks, Truman tanks, T's, to Eastern European countries so that they could adequately fight the communists. They were not as advanced as we were, or as the Russians were. So we thought if we supply them with this money and this military supply, then they could better keep, keep the communists out of their country, and then they would stay capitalist and stay on our side. This comes to a whole new level during the proxy wars. So that was just the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan were instances of military intervention, but it wasn't a full-out war. It was just enough to stop the communists. The proxy wars are actual wars fought between 2 third parties on behalf of the superpowers. So the superpowers would each back a side for or against communism, whichever one they supported, in order to have their ideology win out against the other side. So the first proxy war is the Korean War, which took place from 1950 to 1953. So remember, in 1949, 1 year before this, we had seen China, right next to Korea, fall to communism. The Korean Peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel. The north part decided to be communist. The south part wanted to stay democratic and capitalist. So the north, backed by China, attacks the south. The United Nations sends in troops to support the south and to stop this spread so that we didn't lose the Korean Peninsula to communism. The U.S. also sends troops and money and supplies, their best commander, Douglas MacArthur. So then China and the USSR help North Korea. So it's the UN, the US, and South Korea, China, USSR, North Korea. Those are all the communist ones. So really, after 3 years of fighting, nothing was truly victorious. No side was truly victorious, and nothing was really accomplished. It was still split along the 38th parallel. The North was still communist, and the South was still democratic. So that's really why it's called the Forgotten War, or the major outcome of the war is that nothing really happened. So the Cold War ends in 1991 after more proxy wars, increased competition, and so on. That continues until 1991, when the USSR is eventually dissolved after revolts in the Eastern European satellite state countries. So there is no longer two superpowers. There's the U.S., who remained, and then there's everybody else who's still trying to figure out what kind of government is best for the modern world after World War II, after independence from imperialism, and after the fall of the Cold War. So that's really where we see globalization really start to take its greatest effect. And this also has to do with technological advancements from the 1990s, such as the internet and computers, all the way up to today. So globalization is the increasing interconnectedness of the world due to advancement in communication and technology. This leads to more interconnected societies, cultures, economies, governments, etc. One of the things that interconnects our governments is these supranational organizations. These allow many countries to collaborate to reach a common goal. So member states give up just a little bit of their power for the benefit of the organization. So the common goal of the United Nations, for example, is world peace, stopping human rights violations, making sure all countries remain in check. And coming out of the context of World War II, we can see why an organization like this would benefit the world. So the United Nations is one example. OPEC is an example of how countries can collaborate to reach an economic goal. And then the European Union and the African Union are very similar in that they also allow regionally countries to cooperate to reach political, social, cultural, economic goals within a region. So OPEC supports the mission of petroleum exporting countries, mostly in the Middle East. So petroleum is oil. So if you have a lot of oil, they can kind of control or balance the oil market so there's not too much competition. They almost run a monopoly of the market. Okay, the first major conflict that's still going on today is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In 1947, the UN decided to give 55% of Israel to Israelis, who are only 25% of the population of the region, and 45% to the Arab group known as the Palestinians, which made up 75% of the population. The Arab group, as the Palestinians, I should say, they did not see that as fair because A, they were 3 times the amount of people as the Israelis, and B, they did not have a seat at the table at the UN conference that decided this split. So this created 2 separate countries, Israel and Palestine, but Palestine then organized themselves and attempted to take their fair share of Israel and overthrow the Israelis who they believed were on their land. However, in 6 days after this revolt started, the Israeli army completely defeated the Palestinians, and so this is known as the 6 Days War because it was a total war that only lasted 6 days. And Israel then said, okay, you don't get any land because now we're taking you over since you tried to rebel. So today, Israel is still one country, even though decades of conflict have shifted who has control over what areas. So this also led to conflict within neighboring countries because at different points in time, Israel had power over parts of Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. If you remember the Sinai Peninsula, that's part of Egypt today, but it was once part of Israel. So the Palestinian Authority is run by the terrorist group Hamas, and they control to the west the Gaza Strip, and counterintuitively to the east they control the West Bank, and that's referred to the West Bank of the Jordan River, and that's why it's in the east of Israel. So right on the border of the Mediterranean is the Gaza Strip. And those are 2 main areas of conflict because the populations are shifting. There are refugees everywhere from both sides of the conflict who are living in regions controlled by someone who is not their ethnicity. It's very conflict-ridden region. Second conflict that we talked about is the Persian Gulf War. So Iraq, since the 1970s when the USSR was in Afghanistan and trying to invade the Middle East and have them on the communist side during the Cold War, Iraq became led by the dictator Saddam Hussein. So he wanted the economic benefits of neighboring Kuwait's wealth of oil. So Kuwait had a lot of oil. Saddam Hussein from Iraq wanted that oil. So he decides to march his army into Kuwait. And seeing Kuwait as threatened by a dictator, the U.S. and Great Britain supported Kuwait, which ultimately led to Saddam Hussein's defeat in Kuwait. However, he does remain in power in Iraq until 2003, when the United States kicks him out. So, the third section of this unit was terrorism, and this was a big one. September 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda attacks the United States. Now, one thing I noticed on a lot of your papers, and this is just point to mention, it's not the Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is just the name of the group. You wouldn't say the McKinley Tech, it's just McKinley. So, Al-Qaeda attacks the United States, and one of the reasons they did this was the extremist interpretation of jihad. So jihad is this notion within Islam where there is a classic interpretation, but Muslim extremists interpret it as the responsibility to eliminate all outward opposition to Islam. And because they believe that Western ideals such as education, democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of religion go against the word of Allah, that the U.S. must be eliminated through this process of jihad, or what they interpret as a holy war. So as you guys know, a terrorist attack is intended to coerce a government or a group of society to do what it wants. Blech. Group or society to do what it wants. So the terrorists wanted to demonstrate their hatred towards the United States, and that they believed that the United States and Americans go against their ideals, and essentially they wanted to demonstrate the power of Islam. So they did this by attacking a small, innocent portion of society, intentionally to show the weakness of our government and the strength of their own. So because the Taliban, that Islamic extremist terrorist group that's political, was in power in Afghanistan, they allowed Al-Qaeda to organize attacks and be headquartered in their country. So Al-Qaeda was permitted to organize these attacks in Afghanistan. So it was the government of Afghanistan's fault, indirectly, that we got attacked. Therefore, we use this as justification to send our troops into Afghanistan, and we declare a war on terror globally in order to oust the Taliban and other terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden was the head of Al-Qaeda. So the other thing that comes out of these terrorist attacks is that the U.S. believes Saddam Hussein to be a threat as well. And we thought he might have weapons of mass destruction and intentionally provoke the United States or commit terrorist acts with these weapons because of his dictatorship, and also because of what happened during the Persian Gulf War. So because we believe that they had these illegal weapons of mass destructions, we invade Iraq in 2003. Okay, going back to two places that were imperialized and what's happened to them since independence, India and Africa. The two have a kind of a different story. And a lot of that was how they were imperialized and what they were imperialized for. So India was granted independence from the British in 1947, thanks to Gandhi and his nonviolent movement. And it becomes India and Pakistan. Pakistan was set aside specifically for Muslims. And the region between India and Pakistan, which is known as Kashmir, has been a hotspot for conflict since the split. So this is a very violent region. But India overall has developed infrastructure, it has advanced education, it has a solid democracy. There is still corruption in the society, but overall it is a pretty modern country. This differs from Africa's independence because the Berlin Conference created these multiple countries in Africa that were all just based on what the European powers wanted and not existing ethnicities, existing governments, existing societies. So this led to ethnic conflict within those countries. So for example, the conflict in Darfur in Sudan, which was based on the belief that the ethnically African people believed that the ethnically Arab people in Sudan were getting special treatment by the government. So they revolted. There was a lot of violence and conflict. So the other thing about Africa is that imperialists did not build up the infrastructure there, and they also ravaged the continent of resources. Instead of developing their resources sustainably and developing their infrastructure and their people, they wanted to keep their people oppressed, and they did not leave the continent with these things in place as they did in India. So therefore, that is why we see the problems we see in Africa today. So imperialism also led to the institutionalization of social oppression. So social oppression becoming a institution within society. So one of these things, most notably, is apartheid. Apartheid. Think about the races being kept apart in South Africa. So that was that racial segregation in South Africa. Nelson Mandela, having learned nonviolence from Gandhi, used that to protest against apartheid. He ended up being thrown in prison for 23 years. When he is released from prison for his protests against apartheid, and apartheid starts to weaken a little bit, Mandela is elected to president, and he officially ends all apartheid in 1994, which they're still seeing the effects of that. That wasn't too long ago, only 20 years ago. So in a couple more generations, hopefully all of that racism and social oppression will be totally eliminated from the continent. And so that is all we have for Unit 6 on there. There will not be anything about the Arab Spring, and there won't be anything past modern Africa, which we haven't really done much, but other than review. So if you have any questions, just a reminder to post them on Edmodo so that everybody can see them and see my responses to them, because most likely someone else has the same question you do. So good luck.